30 years. That's how long Cowboy had been dead to the world below, though his heart still beat in the thin mountain air of Colorado territory. At 43, his weathered hands told stories of violence and regret, each scar a reminder of the man he used to be. The townspeople of Cedar Valley whispered his name like a curse. The outlaw who'd vanished into the peaks after that bloody night in 1863. His ranch sat like a forgotten grave on Broken Ridge, where the wind carved loneliness into every timber. The cabin he'd built with his own hands had become his prison, surrounded by the ghosts of choices that haunted his sleep. Every sunrise brought the same routine: tend the horses, mend the fences, and pretend the isolation didn't gnaw at his soul like a hungry wolf. But on this October evening, as storm clouds gathered like dark omens above the peaks, Cowboy's solitude would shatter forever. The boy appeared like a specter in the dying light, stumbling through the pine trees with the desperation of a hunted animal. No more than 12, his clothes torn and muddy, clutching a leather satchel against his chest as if it contained his very life. When he collapsed at Cowboy's doorstep, his blue eyes held secrets that could topple kingdoms. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. "They're coming for me. They killed my pa because of what we found." Cowboy's instincts screamed danger, but something in the child's terror struck a chord he'd thought long dead. Against every survival instinct honed over 3 decades, he pulled the boy inside, barricading the door as thunder rolled across the valley like cannon fire. "What's your name, son?" Cowboy asked, his voice rusty from years of speaking only to horses and memories. "Timothy," the boy gasped, still clutching that mysterious satchel. "Timothy Morrison. My pa was the bank clerk in Cedar Valley. Was." The name Morrison hit Cowboy like a physical blow. He remembered Jacob Morrison, a decent man who'd never judged him, even after that terrible night. If Jacob was dead, and his son was running for his life, then something rotten had taken root in the valley below. "What's in the bag, Timothy?" The boy's hands trembled as he opened the satchel, revealing documents that would make powerful men kill without hesitation. Bank records, land deeds, correspondence bearing the seal of territorial officials, all pointing to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. "Pa found out about the silver mine," Timothy whispered. "The one they said was played out. It ain't played out, mister. It's the richest strike in Colorado territory, and they're stealing it from the Cheyenne reservation. Pa said the governor himself is in on it." Cowboy's blood ran cold. The Cheyenne had been promised that land in perpetuity, but if silver had been discovered, those promises would be worth less than the paper they were written on. And if territorial officials were orchestrating the theft, they'd kill anyone who threatened to expose them. "Who's they, Timothy?" "Sheriff Hawkins, Mayor Caldwell, and that new territorial supervisor, Mr. Blackwood. Pa overheard them planning to frame the Cheyenne for raids they never committed, give the army an excuse to move them off the land. When Pa tried to warn Chief Standing Bear, the boy broke down, and Cowboy felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he'd built around his heart 30 years ago. He'd failed to protect his own family once. He wouldn't fail this boy. Outside, the storm unleashed its fury, but it was nothing compared to the tempest brewing in Cowboy's mind. He'd spent 3 decades running from his past, but maybe it was time to stop running and start fighting. As lightning illuminated the cabin, Cowboy made a decision that would change everything. He would protect Timothy Morrison, even if it meant facing the demons he'd spent half his life avoiding. The boy had brought him more than documents. He'd brought him a chance at redemption. But as the wind howled through the pines, neither of them noticed the distant flicker of torches moving up the mountain trail. The hunters had found their scent, and by dawn, Broken Ridge Ranch would become a battleground where the sins of the past would collide with the hope of the future. The ghost of the mountain was about to become very real indeed. Dawn broke gray and ominous over Broken Ridge, but the storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie silence that set Cowboy's nerves on edge. He'd spent the night watching the trail, Winchester in hand, while Timothy slept fitfully by the dying fire. The boy's fevered whispers had revealed fragments of a conspiracy so vast it made Cowboy's own crimes seem like childhood mischief. "They're not coming up the main trail," Cowboy muttered, studying the landscape through his spyglass. Years of living like a hunted animal had taught him to read the mountain's moods. Too smart for that, Timothy stirred, his young face etched with exhaustion and fear. "How do you know they're coming at all?" "Because men like Sheriff Hawkins don't leave loose ends," Cowboy replied grimly. "And you, son, are the loosest end they've ever faced." The irony wasn't lost on him. 30 years ago, he'd been the one being hunted, fleeing into these same mountains after a bank robbery gone wrong. A robbery that had left 3 men dead and his own soul in tatters. Now he was the protector, and the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any chain. "Tell me about your pa," Cowboy said, needing to understand the full scope of what they were facing. "How did he discover the mine?" Timothy's eyes grew distant. Pa was always good with numbers, real careful-like. When the territorial supervisor, Mr. Blackwood, started making large deposits, PA got curious. The amounts didn't match any known business in the territory, so Pa started following the money trail. The boy pulled out a worn ledger from his satchel, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Pa tracked every transaction, every land purchase, every payoff. They've been buying up Cheyenne land through fake companies using forged documents. The silver mine they discovered has been producing for months. Cowboy studied the ledger, his respect for Jacob Morrison growing with every page. The man had been building an airtight case against some of the most powerful people in Colorado territory. No wonder they'd killed him. "There's more," Timothy continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Pa found out why you really left town 30 years ago." The words hit Cowboy like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "The bank robbery. Pa said you were set up. Sheriff Hawkins needed someone to blame for stealing the Cheyenne Treaty money he'd already stolen himself. You were just convenient." The revelation shattered everything Cowboy thought he knew about his past. For 30 years, he'd carried the guilt of those 3 deaths, believing himself a murderer and a thief. But if Timothy was right, if he'd been framed... "Pa found the real records," Timothy pressed on, "hidden in Sheriff Hawkins' private safe. You never stole that money, mister. You walked into a trap." Before Cowboy could process this earth-shattering news, a rifle shot echoed across the valley, followed by the thunder of approaching horses. Through the window he counted 6 riders emerging from the tree line. Sheriff Hawkins leading a posse of hard men with murder in their eyes. "Timothy, listen to me," Cowboy said urgently, grabbing the boy's shoulders. "There's a cave system behind the cabin, hidden by the waterfall. Take the documents and hide there. No matter what happens, don't come out until you hear 3 shots, then 2, then 3 again. That'll be my signal. What about you?" I'm going to do what I should have done 30 years ago, face the truth. As the riders surrounded the cabin, Cowboy felt a strange peace settle over him. For 3 decades, he'd been running from a crime he didn't commit, carrying shame that belonged to other men. Now, with Timothy's evidence and his own burning need for justice, he finally had a chance to set the record straight. Sheriff Hawkins dismounted, his silver badge gleaming in the morning sun like a mockery of justice. "Come out, Cowboy. We know the boys in there." "I'm coming out, Hawkins," Cowboy called back, stepping onto his porch with hands raised but ready. "But we need to talk first." "Time for talking's over. Hand over the Morrison boy and those documents, and maybe we'll make this quick." Cowboy's laugh was cold as mountain wind. "Funny thing about those documents, Sheriff. They tell quite a story about missing treaty money and silver mines. Makes a man wonder who the real thieves are." He saw the flicker of fear in Hawkins' eyes and knew Timothy had been right. The truth was more powerful than any weapon, but it would take more than truth to keep the boy alive. "You always were too smart for your own good," Hawkins snarled. "Should have stayed dead up here." "Maybe," Cowboy replied, his hand drifting toward his gun. "But sometimes a man has to stop running and start fighting for what's right." The standoff stretched like a taut wire, 6 against 1, with the fate of an entire people hanging in the balance. But Cowboy had spent 30 years preparing for this moment, even if he hadn't known it. The ghost of Broken Ridge was about to become a force of reckoning. The standoff lasted only seconds, but in those heartbeats, Cowboy saw his entire life flash before him. The scared young man he'd been, the bitter exile he'd become, and the protector he was choosing to be. When Sheriff Hawkins reached for his gun, 30 years of survival instinct exploded into action. Cowboy's Colt cleared leather faster than lightning, his first shot taking down Hawkins before the corrupt sheriff could draw. The other 5 men scattered, seeking cover behind rocks and trees. But Cowboy had the advantage of knowing every inch of his mountain fortress. "You killed an innocent man, Hawkins!" Cowboy shouted as bullets splintered the wood around him. "Jacob Morrison died because he found out about your silver mine scheme." "You're a dead man, Cowboy," Deputy Marshal Crenshaw called from behind a boulder. "Territorial Supervisor Blackwood's got 100 men coming up that mountain." But Cowboy was already moving, using the cabin's strategic position and the natural cover of the ridge to his advantage. These weren't the first men who'd tried to kill him on this mountain, and his survival had taught him lessons that no amount of badges could overcome. The gunfight raged for 20 minutes, echoing across the valley like thunder. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Hawkins' men lay dead, and the other 2 had fled down the mountain, carrying word of their failure back to their masters. Cowboy checked his wounds, a graze on his shoulder, nothing serious, then gave the all-clear signal. Timothy emerged from the cave, his face pale but determined. "Is it over?" the boy asked. "This part is," Cowboy replied grimly. But Crenshaw was right about Blackwood. "We've got maybe 6 hours before this mountain's crawling with territorial militia." Timothy clutched his father's documents tighter. "What do we do?" Cowboy studied the papers again, his mind racing. The evidence was damning, but it would mean nothing if they couldn't get it to someone with the power and integrity to act on it. Then inspiration struck. "Fort Collins," he said suddenly. "Colonel Marcus Webb commands the garrison there. I served under him during the war. He's one of the few honest men left in this territory. That's a 2-day ride through hostile country," Timothy pointed out. "Not the way I know." Cowboy smiled grimly. There's an old mining trail that cuts through Cheyenne territory. If we can reach Chief Standing Bear, he might help us get to the fort." It was a desperate plan, but as they prepared to leave Broken Ridge Ranch, Cowboy felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years. Hope. Not just for his own redemption, but for justice itself. They rode hard through the afternoon, following deer trails and forgotten paths that Cowboy had mapped during his years of exile. As the sun began to set, they reached the edge of Cheyenne territory, where Standing Bear's people had been forced to scratch out an existence on land that was supposed to be theirs forever. The Cheyenne warriors who intercepted them were suspicious at first, but when Timothy showed them his father's documents and Cowboy explained the conspiracy, Chief Standing Bear himself came to meet them. "I remember you," the chief said to Cowboy in accented English. "You traded with us fairly, never cheated or lied. Why do you help us now?" "Because 30 years ago, I was framed for stealing money that belonged to your people," Cowboy replied honestly. "I've been running from a crime I didn't commit while the real thieves got rich off your land." Standing Bear studied the documents, his weathered face growing darker with each page. "This Blackwood, he promises us new reservation if we move peacefully. Says old land is cursed, no good for farming." "He's lying," Timothy said urgently. "The land is worth millions in silver. They're planning to frame your people for raids you never committed. Give the army an excuse to force you off." The chief's eyes blazed with controlled fury. "Then we must stop them. But how?" "Help us reach Fort Collins," Cowboy said. "Colonel Webb has the authority to investigate territorial corruption. With your testimony and these documents, we can expose the whole conspiracy." Standing Bear nodded slowly. "My best warriors will escort you. But know this, if you betray us, if this is trap, you will not leave our territory alive." "I understand," Cowboy replied. "And Chief, when this is over, when the truth comes out, I'll make sure your people get back every acre they stole from you." As they prepared for the dangerous journey to Fort Collins, Cowboy felt the weight of his past finally beginning to lift. For 30 years, he'd been a ghost haunted by crimes he didn't commit. Now, with Timothy's courage and Standing Bear's trust, he had a chance to become something more, a force for justice, in a world that had forgotten what the word meant. But the hardest part still lay ahead. Territorial Supervisor Blackwood wouldn't go down without a fight, and the corruption ran deeper than any of them imagined. The final confrontation would test everything Cowboy had learned about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of redemption. The ride to Fort Collins became a race against time and treachery. Cowboy, Timothy, and their Cheyenne escorts pushed through the night, knowing that Blackwood's men were scouring the territory for them. As dawn broke over the Colorado plains, they could see the fort's flag flying in the distance, a beacon of hope in a landscape poisoned by corruption. But their relief was short-lived. A dust cloud on the horizon revealed a company of territorial militia riding hard to intercept them, led by the man himself, Territorial Supervisor Blackwood, a tall, cold-eyed politician whose ambition had no limits. "There!" Blackwood shouted, pointing at their small group. "The fugitives who murdered Sheriff. Hawkins, shoot them down!" "Ride!" Chief Standing Bear commanded his warriors, but Cowboy had already made his decision. "No," he said firmly, pulling up his horse. "Running won't solve this. Timothy, give me those documents." "But they'll kill you," the boy protested. "Maybe," Cowboy replied with a grim smile, "but sometimes a man has to make a stand. Besides, I've got an ace up my sleeve. As Blackwood's militia surrounded them, Cowboy noticed something that made his heart leap. A column of blue-uniformed cavalry riding out from Fort Collins, led by a familiar figure. Colonel Marcus Webb, his old commanding officer, had seen the confrontation and was coming to investigate. "Stand down, all of you," Colonel Webb commanded as his troops formed a protective circle around Cowboy's group. "I'll have an explanation for this armed confrontation on federal territory." Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "Colonel, these men are fugitives. They murdered Sheriff Hawkins and kidnapped this boy." "That's a lie!" Timothy shouted, his young voice carrying across the plain. "They killed my father because he found out about the silver mine conspiracy." Colonel Webb's experienced eyes took in the scene, the Cheyenne warriors, the territorial militia, and the unlikely pair of Cowboy and Timothy. "I think we'd better sort this out at the fort. All parties will accompany me for a proper hearing." The next hour would change the course of Colorado Territory's history. In Colonel Webb's office, with federal marshals as witnesses, Timothy presented his father's meticulously documented evidence. The ledgers, correspondence, and land deeds painted a picture of corruption so vast it reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "This is preposterous," Blackwood blustered. "The word of a dead bank clerk and a known outlaw against territorial officials." But Colonel Webb was studying a particular document that made his face go pale. "This letter," he said quietly, "bears the seal of the War Department. It authorizes the forced relocation of the Cheyenne based on fabricated raid reports." "I can explain that," Blackwood began. "You forged federal documents," Webb interrupted, his voice deadly calm. "That's treason, Mr. Blackwood." The territorial supervisor's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand. That silver mine could fund territorial development for decades. A few Indians and one meddling bank clerk were a small price to pay for progress." His confession sealed his fate. Within minutes, federal marshals had Blackwood in chains, along with the surviving members of his conspiracy. The corruption that had poisoned Cedar Valley for years was finally exposed to the light. But for Cowboy, the most important moment came when Colonel Webb handed him an official document. "Based on the evidence presented and considering the testimony of Chief Standing Bear, I'm issuing a full federal pardon for the crimes you were falsely accused of 30 years ago. You're a free man, Cowboy." The words hit him like a physical blow. Free. After 3 decades of exile and shame, he was finally free. "What about Timothy?" Cowboy asked, looking at the boy who had become like a son to him. "Well," Colonel Webb smiled, "he's going to need a guardian while we sort out his father's estate. Know anyone who might be interested in the job?" Timothy's face lit up with hope, and Cowboy felt his heart swell with an emotion he'd thought dead forever: love for family, chosen rather than born. 6 months later, Cowboy stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch, watching Timothy practice his reading with the new school teacher they'd hired for the valley. The silver mine had been returned to the Cheyenne, who had agreed to share the profits with the territorial government in exchange for guaranteed land rights. Chief Standing Bear had become a frequent visitor, and the two former enemies had forged a friendship based on mutual respect and shared justice. The town of Cedar Valley had welcomed Cowboy back as a hero, but he preferred the quiet of his mountain home. Here, with Timothy's laughter echoing across the ridge and the knowledge that he'd finally made peace with his past, he'd found something more valuable than silver: Redemption. As the sun set over the Colorado peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cowboy reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A frightened boy had stumbled onto his ranch carrying secrets that changed everything. But in the end, it wasn't the documents that had saved them. It was the courage to do what was right, even when the cost seemed too high to bear. Timothy looked up from his book and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" "Just grateful," Cowboy replied, putting his arm around the boy's shoulders. "Sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places." The ghost of Broken Ridge Ranch had finally found his peace, and in protecting one vulnerable child, he'd discovered that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to fight for it. The secret Timothy had brought wasn't just about corruption and conspiracy. It was about the power of truth to heal old wounds and create new families from the ashes of the past. In the end, justice had prevailed, and love had conquered the loneliness that had haunted the mountain for 30 long years. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new, amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.